Hi guys, welcome to part 4 of classification processes. Last lesson you should have looked at 3 learning goals. The first one was to define a clade. So that would basically be a group of organisms that consists of a common ancestor and all of its linear descendants. The other thing you should have been able to do is recall the 3 common assumptions and what they mean for cladistics. So we're looking at a common ancestor, bifurcation, and physical change. So as you move along, you get a greater amount of physical change. And the last thing you should be able to do is interpret and infer evolutionary relatedness from cladograms. So that's looking at the common ancestor to show that if one organism is more closely related to another. So getting into today's learning goals, the first one is to recognize the multiple need for definitions of species. So we're going to look at 2 definitions of species. So one's a biological, one's a phylogenetic definition of species, and look at some of the limitations, organisms it works well for and ones it doesn't. You also need to identify one example of an interspecific hybrid that does not produce fertile offspring, so example a mule, and explain the classification of organisms according to the following species interactions, so predation, competition, symbiosis, and disease. So let's get into it. So the first thing, let's start with the biological species concept. So our biological species concept simply states that a species is a group of organisms whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, i.e. fertile, offspring. So let's look at a couple of these, but breaking down basically the bits. So interbreed in nature and produce viable, i.e. fertile offspring. So that's the key idea. That basically if one member comes along another member, probably not the best use of word there, and they're in nature, they can get together and produce something that's good in a simple way there, all right? So looking at this biological species concept, it works great for sexually reproducing organisms because this is the whole idea. Can this one and this one get it on and produce something viable? However, that doesn't help every organism because, as you know, not every organism is actually sexually reproducing, as we looked at previously when we looked at different types of reproduction. So it does pose many problems, and we're going to look at a couple of which problems it does pose, just so you can understand some of these limitations. So we're going to look at hybrids, asexually reproducing organisms, fossils, ring species, and infertile organisms. All right, so get this table down. I think it's a great way just to summarize all of it. You've got those main categories there, and just an explanation how it does limit that classification for those organisms there. So let's start with a hybrid. Well, what is a hybrid? A hybrid is an organism resulting from a cross between parents of 2 different species. All right, so you know with hybrid cars, they may be electric and petrol. Okay, it's a hybrid, 2 different things going on there, and they're usually producing offspring that are sterile. So you can look at this one here, and you can see that this is really a cross between a tiger and a lion, and these offspring tend to be infertile. So it depends if it's a male lion and a female tiger. So clearly this one is a male lion and a female tiger. This one here is a male tiger and a female lion. Now, very rarely do these organisms ever encounter one another in nature. So this is something that's really happened in captivity there. So when we consider this biological species concept, it can be quite difficult because, for example, here we've got polar bears and a grizzly bear with these 2 organisms here. And because of climate change, these 2 organisms are actually now starting to interact more and more. As these polar bears are heading further south, they're heading into grizzly country, and we're getting a greater amount of interaction between them. Now, they can interbreed. They can produce fertile, viable offspring in the wild. However, there are so many other physiological and behavioral differences that don't fit a polar bear and grizzly bear being the same species there. So when we consider these, a polar bear and a grizzly bear, it can be a prisley or a growler bear, depending on the male-female interaction. So they are actually fertile, as I said. So they are 2 species, okay, 2 members that can reproduce in nature and produce a viable fertile offspring. However, you know, because there's so many other differences, we don't want to, as scientists and those classifying, put them together as one. So that is a limitation there. You can have things like this, so a zebra and a horse, so you've got a zorse, And this is one of the things people don't quite realize. All right, in this case, it looks white there. but zebras are actually black with white stripes, just to clear that one up for many people. They are infertile. So that is an example of a interspecific hybrid, so a horse and a zebra that produce infertile offspring. So which animals for this one? You probably guessed correctly. It's a dolphin and a whale, i.e. a wholphin. And the female wholphin is fertile, the male wholphin is infertile. The other limitation that can come in is to asexually reproducing organisms. So some bacteria and unicellular eukaryotes, like those protozoa, here we've got a protozoa called amoeba, they, or other organisms like the lizards we looked at, they reproduce by parthenogenesis. So bacteria, you might remember, as binary fission, the amoeba there by fission, and those lizards, some bees, by parthenogenesis. I.e. they do not form gametes, so eggs or sperm, or exchange genetic material when they reproduce. So therefore their ability to interbreed in nature can't really be tested. And as a result of that, asexually reproducing organisms do not fit well in a biological species definition, because we cannot effectively test their ability to interbreed in nature, because they are reproducing asexually. Fossils provides another limitation to this species concept. A fossil is no longer alive, obviously, and therefore it cannot be classified on its basis of its ability to reproduce. There's not two fossils getting up in some museum and taking a fancy for one another. That is not happening. So when we look at fossils, you cannot use a biological species classification to actually put them as separate species. You need to look at other things there. Ring species. Okay, so ring species might be a different concept. So some population of organisms that live close to each other can actually sexually reproduce with their neighbors. However, as you move further away, they cannot reproduce and produce viable offspring. The interesting thing is there's still a change of genetic information between them. So for example, A here might be able to reproduce with B, potentially even, I shouldn't say B, the orange, potentially even the blue, but let's say they can't, so you could reproduce with this one can reproduce with this one, but not this one, okay? You might get the idea. Here, by the time you reach the ends, which is the most likely case here, these two cannot reproduce, yet it's able to still reproduce with organisms that were able to reproduce with other ones here. That might sound confusing. But the basic idea is you're still getting this exchange of genetic material between them, and that does provide a bit of a limitation for this, because ring species here, when they live close together, they're able to exchange genetic information, yet they may be different species themselves, so that becomes a bit of an issue. And the last one is infertile offsprings, or I should say organisms. So many social insects, so we're talking about bees, ants, termites, living together in big groups, have different castes of males. So they have fertile females and they might have infertile females, all right? So those ones that all of a sudden when the queen's gone, they may develop into the fertile female. So some are unable to reproduce and therefore their species cannot be classified because they're actually not able to reproduce there. So infertile organisms like some bees, ants and termites, well, they do cause a problem because here we are not having two individuals being able to reproduce and produce viable offspring in nature. So that again means on that classification, it's difficult to classify these organisms under that species definition of the biological one. So you've got infertile organisms like mules, and they're an example, and this is one of the examples they say for you to know, so know it. It's an interspecific hybrid, so between two different species, and they are produced when a female horse is impregnated by a male donkey. So you've got a horse and a donkey, and they produce mules. So mules are infertile, so a mule is unable to reproduce there. So that again causes an issue with this species concept. So female donkeys that are impregnated by male horses, well, they're called hinnies, all right? So they're different. So whenever you see a mule, you know that it's been a female horse impregnated by a male donkey there. So those infertile organisms, they do cause a problem to this species definition because a horse and a donkey can reproduce. They're not producing fertile offspring, okay? They're producing infertile offspring like mules, so they're not viable. Obviously, therefore, classified as two different species. When you consider and look at a bit of chromosome, horses have 64 chromosomes and donkeys have 62. Therefore, mules have 63 chromosomes, and it's that odd number which does them in, okay, because generally they don't form successful gametes, i.e. sperm and egg, which are haploid, if you remember that, which contains half the number of chromosomes. So here, when you consider horses, if they've got 64, well, when you look at that, their chromosomes, so their sperm and egg, they're going to have 32 in each sperm and egg, and a donkey, 62, that's its diploid, 2 sets, divide by 2 is going to have 31 chromosome in each sperm and egg. Put these together, all right, and you can see that you end up with 63 chromosomes in that organism. So looking at this, a little summary. So hybrid offspring are usually sterile and therefore do not produce fertile offspring, which causes an issue to that definition. Asexual reproducing organisms, the ability to interbreed in natural conditions, therefore cannot be tested, showing the biological species concept only applies to sexually reproducing organisms, not asexual. Fossils, no longer alive, cannot be classified based on reproduction. Ring species, obviously here when we talked about some populations of organisms that live close together can sexually reproduce with their neighbours. However, as you move further away, they cannot reproduce to produce viable offspring. It does cause an issue, and infertile organisms are unable to interbreed and therefore their species cannot be classified under that biological species concept, which is all about can they reproduce to produce viable offspring in nature. So you can see these limitations in that biological species definition led and required the need for multiple definitions of species, because we can't just use that one definition because it doesn't fit for all those different organisms and types we looked at. And this led to the phylogenetic species concept. So the phylogenetic species concept identifies a species as the smallest group of individuals having a common ancestor. So when we look at these guys here, we can see that they have a common ancestor there. So we know that the African savanna elephants are more closely related to the African forest elephants than they are the Asian elephants, using our bit of cladistic knowledge there. So looking at this, they have unique DNA sequences, and DNA and our knowledge of that led to the advancements in this. We can see that these are our species, all right, so African forest elephants, and these are the different populations of those African forest elephants or the African savanna and the Asian elephants there. So when we compare these two definitions, so biological concept is a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. The phylogenetic concept, so a definition, is the smallest group of organisms that can share a common ancestor and can be distinguished by a unique set of morphological and or genetic traits. Now the criteria, these ones require reproductive isolation, so they cannot successfully interbreed with other species. That's the basic idea. If you cannot successfully interbreed with this one here, you're classified as a different species. So these ones here must be distinguishable from other such groups, and it does not rely on reproductive isolation. So they're looking at a unique set of either morphological, so talking about those structural, or genetic traits to classify them. Now this really works well for sexually reproducing organisms. It's a great way to separate it. While these ones here, the phylogenetic species concept, works well for asexual organisms, okay, because we can actually classify them based on that concept, so the phylogenetic concept, but it also works really well for detecting recent divergences, so when organisms split, particularly when we start looking at genetic traits, okay, because we can get that greater level of detail to understand when different divergence, so the splitting of two different organisms there occurs. Difficulties. So this is difficult to apply to asexual organisms, particularly, and difficult to apply to extinct organisms. Obviously, you know, infertile organisms, ring species as well, and those hybrid organisms. The phylogenetic concept can require enough genomic diversity to evaluate. So it does require a certain amount of genetic information to put that summary, I guess more succinctly, and can result in an increased number of species, because it's the smallest group of organisms that share a common ancestor. So all of a sudden it starts to blow out the number of species that we have. The idea though, looking at these limitations, you see that there's a need for multiple definitions of a species, that one definition does not just hit the mark completely, okay? So that's kind of the learning goal for there. You understand what a species is, yeah, but then you understand that there's multiple definitions that are required. When we look at species interactions, they can also be used to classify organisms based on competition, symbiosis, predation, and disease. because they have a wide-ranging effects also on the ecosystems, these different interactions. You might recall, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail like I have previously, because we've talked previously about these interactions, so hopefully you know it. Obviously, we've got predation, so one organism attacks, which we call the predator, and kills the other, which is the prey. So we can classify organisms or group them as predators or prey. That's one way we can classify. Disease, so disease-causing organisms, pathogens, can damage and kill their host. So we can separate and classify into those organisms which cause disease, okay? So they're disease-causing organisms, we group them as pathogens, and we can look at their different hosts and classify that way. Competition, where species compete with each other because they require the same resources to fulfill their needs for survival. So we can look at a different type of competition and how that may impact on different organisms. Again, looking at some of those traits and interactions to help with classification. Symbiosis. So when we consider symbiosis, there's three main ones we looked at. One is mutualism. So remember, symbiosis is where at least one of those organisms benefits from the interaction. So these are all biotic interactions. First one was mutualism, where both organisms benefit from the interaction. So you can use that to understand that you've got a positive and positive interaction for both organisms. Commensalism, this is where one organism benefits while the other one is not harmed. And we did look at the fact that commensalism is very difficult because it's hard to not harm or not help a certain organism based on those interactions. And the last one was parasitism. So one organism, we can classify them as a parasite benefits, and the one that's harmed, we classify as a host. So those different ones can be used to group different organisms, as I said, really more looking at, your predator, prey, disease with pathogens, parasites, grouping organisms as a parasite there. But we can look at certain other things when we refer to those interactions there. So let's quickly test your knowledge, see if you understand these different ones. So I've given you a few case studies. So I want you to identify the type of interaction and describe how each species is affected. So benefits, harms, no effect in the following scenarios. First one, honeyeaters are nectar-feeding birds common in Australia. Many plant species, including proteas and myrtles, are pollinated by honeyeaters. So this interaction, it's a type of symbiosis, and the type of symbiosis, you should all be there, is mutualism. Why? Because we have a positive interaction. The bird, positive, it gets honey. The plant, it gets pollinated, positive. That is a symbiotic relationship. Next one. Here we've got the squat anemone shrimp, also known as the sexy shrimp, and it lives among the tentacles of sea anemones, where it gains protection and scavenges scraps of food from the anemone. The anemone is apparently neither harmed nor benefit by the shrimp's presence. Again, very difficult to do, but they're saying there's not a significant benefit or significant harm to the anemone. So when we look at this, it is a symbiotic relationship. So the shrimp benefits, the anemone very neutral. So in that case, that is an example of commensalism. Okay, hopefully you got that. This one, dingoes will kill and scavenge a range of species in groups of 2 or more. They can attack and kill large animals such as kangaroos, but will also scavenge carrion such as dingoes with fish on Fraser Island. All right, so looking at this interaction, well, here we've got the dingo, which is going to be your predator, and obviously these organisms here, they will be your prey. So you can see that that is a predator-prey interaction. Dingo benefits and the prey is harmed. Very simple there. Looking at this one, the Australian paralysis tick. It lives attached to the skin of mammalian hosts, including bandicoots, koalas, possums, and kangaroos, where it sucks body fluids and causes irritation. Most native species are immune to the tick's toxin, but it can cause paralysis to susceptible species, particularly things like dogs and that, because they did not actually grow up with this tick. They haven't evolved over time to be immune, like many of the Australian organisms which have been there. So this time you get the tick, which benefits, it gets the body fluids, the host, which is a negative interaction, and this is an idea of parasitism. It can cause different diseases like Lyme disease, but technically the tick doesn't necessarily want to kill exactly because it wants that organism still alive. Most parasites will want to keep that organism alive there. However, this can lead to paralysis to susceptible species, which can lead to death, unfortunately, for that organism. So this is an example of parasitism. So the tick is a parasite, and these organisms here will be the hosts. Last one, lions and cheetahs feed on similar prey. Both organisms are negatively impacted by the presence of the other because there is less food available. However, they still persist together. Now, this idea is competition. And in this type of competition, both really do lose out. Sometimes competition can be beneficial, interspecifically, if, for example, there's organisms that are able to get some extra food. However, in this case, they're both negatively impacted by the presence of each other because there's less food available. So we say it's competition and both are negatively impacted there. So guys, hopefully that has helped you understand a couple of things from this lesson. The first one is there's a need for multiple definitions of species because that biological species concept does not cover things like asexually reproducing organisms, fossils, hybrids, infertile organisms, or even ring species properly. So there's a need for multiple definitions. Another definition is that phylogenetic species concept. The big problem with that though is you need a large amount of data, and also the fact that it can result in huge numbers of species, so an increased number of species compared to the other one as you start to get down to the nitty-gritty and realize that there's a lot of similarities between that. You also needed to find an example of an interspecific hybrid, which is infertile, and we gave you that example of a mule. So you can see that the mule, you've got the female horse and the male donkey breed together to produce a mule, and it is infertile, so it cannot reproduce. And that was down to the number of chromosomes there. It cannot successfully form sperm and egg. And the last thing we looked at is species interactions. So you need to know those different species interactions. So you've got predation, you've got competition. In the symbiotic ones, we looked at mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, and understand how we can group or classify different organisms based on those interactions, such as a disease-causing organism, a parasite, whether it's a predator, a prey, and you've got those positive and negatives, or positive, neutral, or positive, positive, depending on the type of interaction for that organism. Hopefully that's helped clear some of those things up, and make sure you watch the next video.